Rangeland improvements are one of the many different ways that we actually have the ability to increase the quality of rangeland. So, if you guys remember in the early part of the semester, we talked about a certain percentage of rangelands that were either in fair or poor condition, and by the 1980s, they had transitioned a lot of those acres into at least good to excellent condition. So range improvements can help with that process. So one example that we see here on this slide is the same exact spot taken about 50 years apart. So on the left-hand side is a picture of the Chihuahuan Desert Rangeland Research Station in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and this was in the 1950s. So one of the major issues for this piece of rangeland was that it was overgrazed for an extensive period of time before management really came into play, and that was preceded by severe drought. So they went through about a 6-year drought period and didn't really adjust stocking rates because of that. So one of the major issues that they saw over time was a lot of bare ground, and you can see that in between the shrubs here on this picture to the left. Through intensive management over the next 50 years, they were actually able to fill in a bunch of that bare ground with grasses, like perennial grasses, and they did this without any additional seeding. They did it mainly through grazing and resting practices. So the ability to improve rangeland really comes down to increasing the quality of that rangeland. Improvements are important to increase the quality of rangeland, like we just talked about. And so in 2001, the Bureau of Land Management did a very large, extensive survey of all the land that they manage in the U.S. And the land that they had in California, which, keep in mind, is going to be more so on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevadas, were classified into 4 major categories: improving, static, decreasing, or undetermined. And so the amount of static land, so land that wasn't transitioning, wasn't improving, but also wasn't decreasing in quality, was very high, about 45 or 4.5 million acres. However, the percentage of land that BLM owned that was improving was approximately a little over 1 million acres. So you can see that just the major difference in how we classify rangeland. And if we did, or if BLM did this same survey today, a lot of that static land, my guess, would actually be in the decreasing column. And that's because a lot of the BLM land in California is heavily occupied by wild horses, and the increasing population trends with wild horses have really degraded a lot of BLM ground over the last 15 years. So improvements are important for a second reason: to maintain costs and return ratios. So few practices or few improvement practices yield good returns under standard economic conditions. And when we say standard economic conditions, we're talking about the constant roller coaster of good economy versus recessionative economy. So, in order to help improve rangeland, improve the quality of rangeland, and also improve the bottom line of an operation, rangeland improvements become very important to the future and the succession of that operation. So, you have, as a rangeland manager, you have to be thinking about the future of the vegetation that's on that type of range. If the stand is lost, then renovating that existing stand would be very, very costly. So it's actually cheaper in the long run to just maintain and try to improve than actually trying to do a full renovation later down the road. Secondly, we have major issues with invasive species and increasing soil erosion. So we see with the increasing species or increasing invasive species that they can actually degrade the soil, because a lot of those species are not going to be adding to the organic matter of the soil content. So the bottom line when it comes to improvements is depleting rangeland is very, very costly, not only to the current generation but to future generations. So it has to be managed. So in order to uh, instill or begin a lot of improvements on rangeland, you need a plan. So, and more so than a plan, you need a program. So this is not just do one thing, check the box, yes, we have an improvement. This is really a process. So that process or that program begins with a current inventory. So you guys in your group projects are doing inventories as a beginning step to figure out what you have on your ranch and or your operation and what you need. The second step is to then go in and identify where improvements can be made. So what are your goals? What are your objectives? And then that is followed by a budget. So you can plan all you want, but if you don't have the budget or you don't have it built in to your budget, then you're really going to be up a creek down the road, because a lot of improvements can be very costly. So it's not something that a lot of people will, like bankers, will invest in without a really good business plan. The fourth step is to implement the the uh, the improvement, and this can happen either all at once or over time. And then finally, the last step is to assess your improvement and monitor your improvement every single year, sometimes 2 to 3 times a year. So when assessing a range condition in the first step of this program, you really need to assess what the health of the rangeland is. So is it in excellent condition, good, fair, or poor condition? So the classification in the table that you see in the middle of the slide, it needs to be included in your rangeland inventory. So as you guys are doing inventories for your ranch, you need to make an assessment of how much range land on your operation is actually fitting into each one of these categories. And no, it's not all going to fit into the excellent category. So if you identify parts of your operation or parts of the land that you own or manage as good or excellent, then you want to maintain that. You may want to try to move some of the good ground into the excellent category, but that would actually take quite a bit of money. So a good condition is acceptable. However, if you have portions of land that are classified as fair or poor, then the goal that you need to have in your range management plan is to improve those areas. So alternative methods to assessing rangeland can actually be and using a different type of system. So the poor, fair, good, and excellent system that I showed you on the previous slide is just one way to assess the range condition. This alternative method really has the same categories as before, but they're based on a little bit of a different principle. So I'm going to switch back to the previous slide real quick. So in the old system that we've been talking about, this is really based on the percentage of the climax population. So the population of vegetation that should be there. So if you have a piece of rangeland that you think is excellent quality, then 76 to 100% of the original vegetation will be there. That means that over the past 100 years, you've seen very little invasion of invasive species. And then those percentages go down, as do the rangeland condition. This second method really is similar, but instead of the percentage of climate populations or climax populations, it's really based on something I think is a little or is more realistic, and that's seral populations. So 100 years ago, we didn't have great records of what plant species were actually on rangeland. A lot of that decision was made based on observation, Native American and early settler accounts, and some fossils, but very few. So today, what one of the ways that we can actually assess rangeland is on this seral population, where in the seral population is where you have a percentage of vegetation, a high, mid, or low percentage of vegetation that is actually functional in that system. So this does not include invasive plants, especially invasive plants that have no forage value. But this becomes important in California because a lot of our plants are annuals now. And there's a huge argument that says that they used to be perennials, but the annuals still function in our system. They still have great forage value. They're still very functional. So that would be a seral population. So if you have a piece of rangeland and I would still classify our rangeland north of town on Meridian Road as good, because even though we had some star thistle in there, it didn't take over the entire range property. So there was still a large percentage of that entire property that was in good plants, good annual plants. So I would say that's probably a high seral classification.